Hello and welcome to DMC Hall of Fame, where I, your host, Astinia, talks about very important players and/or their works throughout Devil May Cry's history. We are going to be talking about one of my favorite players of all time, TatsumaruBlack. In my opinion, he is the first competent freestyler ever. He is really good at improvising. His Dante and Virgil movement are unparalleled at the time. Quite frankly, he was pretty up there when it comes to speed and APM as well. He is also known for his unorthodox recording style, in which he uses a VCR to record gameplay. It was a running gag at the time that, his gameplay video quality was pretty bad. But even then, in 2010 or so, when I started watching videos, I thought his video quality was pretty good. I think it was just an exaggeration, but I can understand, Whenever you see interlaced footage of DMC3, you just immediately think TatsumaruBlack. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. Legendary Darkslayer. This is his first video on his channel. It is allegedly the first Virgil DMC3 combo video. And in my opinion, this combo video isn't very refined compared to the other entries that we have seen. A lot of it seems to be sort of improvised or freestyle clips, not really a very thought out start to finish of an enemy. Nevertheless, there are a lot of interesting and cool stuff. A lot of things that become standard later in today's era. For this first clip, we see this setup right here, the trick up into Helmbreaker into Swordstorm. This is fairly advanced for the time, and it sort of set the groundwork for what is in modern day DMC3 Virgil whenever an enemy is laying on the ground. And so this is one of the reasons it's impressive. The other reason why it's impressive is that this takes a fair amount of inputs and complexity to do compared to much of the other things that were happening around the time. To put it in perspective, to trick up, you need to use your trick button. To Helmbreaker, you need to use your melee weapon. To Swordstorm, you have to use your shoot button. And also, to Swordstorm, you need to hold down the shoot for a while you're doing everything else. You need to jump cancel the Helmbreaker, so that's the jump button. It uses 4 buttons in total, outside of lock-on, which I will just assume doesn't exist because you should be holding on to lock-on at all times. But yes, this is pretty impressive. And again, you have to be holding Swordstorm during this, and to do Swordstorm, you have to lock on, move the analog stick forward, and then press the sword button. Before pressing the sword button, you're holding it down. For the time, this is fairly impressive. A lot of players nowadays use one of the shoulder buttons for shoot. That way you can use another finger to hold down your swords formations, which is like super important for Virgil, while doing a bunch of other actions with your thumb. It basically frees up your thumb, makes it a little bit easier to do. But at the time, this wasn't always adopted. Some players just had the shoot button on square. I know for me personally, I wasn't around during this time, but around the 2010s, very early 2010s, I used to use my index finger, my left index finger, to hold down on the square button while my right thumb, doing like all these other actions. So it is possible, but it is quite impressive to do this consistent. Next clip we have Rave into dive kick JCs. Now this is fairly standard. You would expect this to be standard immediately after Virgil was released, simply because we see similar things in pre-special edition era. But it is worth noting that this is basically the only JC type you can do with Virgil on normal enemies while juggling an airborne enemy. We later down the line see more interesting form patterns and stuff when it comes to DT'd enemies, because you can connect the Helmbreaker and not knock the enemy down with DT'd enemies if you do it right. But this will come later down the line in the series. For now, you just gotta know that this is one of the earliest forms of JC with Virgil on an airborne enemy, and it was done pretty slick. It was pretty fast. It is, high APM for the time still. And again, some of this is turbo mode, so yeah. We see some Helmbreaker into Raves JCs on an enemy that is laying down. This is basically how a DMC3 player with Virgil starts out when it comes to style play. When an enemy is laying down, you will pick up Helmbreaker into JC and then repeat the sequence over and over again. I started doing this because I liked seeing Boss Virgil do this against me, and you kind of feel like Boss Virgil doing this against an enemy. But you can add another layer of complexity to this, which is after the JC'd Helmbreaker, you can do Raves and then repeat the process, trick up, Helmbreaker, JC, Raves, trick up, Helmbreaker, JC, Raves. This is essentially the basics of Virgil against an opponent that is laying on the ground. Next video is Sword of Vengeance. This is allegedly the first Dante and Virgil combo video. Similar to the last one, I don't think it's necessarily that perfect, but there are a lot of interesting stuff here as well for the time. And also he uses some of the clips from his Virgil combo video into this one. So first off, in this clip, it seems, and I cannot tell for certain because of the quality, but it seems that he's JCing a volcano, which is perhaps the first time we see this ever. The JCs are fairly varied in this other clip, but the more important part, I think, is that he is able to adjust his height. You can imagine a circular hitbox kind of thing around an enemy. This hitbox, if you're close to it, you will be able to jump cancel, to jump off of the enemy. If you're too high up or too down low, or if you're too far away from him horizontally, just if you're too far away from him, period, you will not be able to jump cancel. And so being able to be in this sweet spot is important, and managing your height over time is important. So here, he seems to be very low. He's almost out of range to jump cancel. He jump cancels off the enemy and makes the jump cancel play out a little. This way, Dante gains a little bit of height. And then, as soon as he's pretty much leveled with the enemy, he starts attacking. If this was done intentionally, this is super impressive, because even to this day, sort of delaying an attack after jump cancel can be a little bit difficult on your brain, especially if you're doing it off of like an improvised. You don't see that often. As time goes on, it becomes harder, because the more sort of tight your JCs become, and you're doing this against a DT'd enemy and whatnot, where JCs are a lot more demanding, adjusting your height like this is pretty damn hard. Very few players are able to do it consistently. We also see more ground JCs on an enemy. He's going Hellbreaker into dive kick. And yeah, it's pretty nice. Now, in my opinion, Trickster Evolution Z is one of his, to be honest, I'm going to say it, it is his best work. Not his best work ever. He improves as a player over time, but it is his best work for the time. Trickster Evolution Z is an apt name because it revolutionized Trickster. It was finished in a day, which is, it boggles my mind. For that time period, in a day, it's just crazy. His usage of the environment is so beautiful. He uses the walls for wall running and the poles for pole playing, and we'll talk about how pole play is useful. Let's say you jump, and then you do an air hike. You only get one air hike in the air, unless you hit the ground or you jump cancel off of an enemy. This is why jump canceling is fundamentally so important, because not only can you cancel moves, but you can do that move over and over again, or combine it with other moves without having to worry about running out of moves there. There's a third option, and this third option is doing pole play. When you do pole play, your air moves reset. So you can do an air hike again, you can do Sky again, and so on. And he uses this very well. Like in this first clip, first of all, like, look at how he runs up the wall, and like as soon as Dante jumps off the wall, it basically puts him in position for pole play. This is really good understanding of the area he's playing in. He sort of maps out the area and knows what options he has in certain areas of the room. I think this is why wall running is so good, and this is why DMC in the future should have more moves that are context specific based on the environment, is because it kind of adds another layer of depth to the game, where not only are you worrying about the enemies, but you're also worrying about your environment and what you can do to maximize your stylishness. And so yeah, we see sort of like standard procedures being done here, sort of like flowcharts based on where he is positioned in the room. He moves across the room very fluently. I'm going to call them checkpoints for now, but what I'm going to call checkpoints are basically places in which he can reset his air moves. So one checkpoint is, well, actually, I'll expand on that definition and say that another checkpoint is something that he can do with the environment. So one checkpoint is the enemy. You can get close to an enemy and JC off of it so that you can still maintain your airborne moves, right? But he can also move towards a pole, where it also resets his air moves and does something interesting with the environment. And then get to the wall, where he can do wall running, and, you know, he moves from one place to another. And the sort of tying in, moving from checkpoint to checkpoint, is just so beautiful. And it sort of sets a precedent for how DMC should be played, especially with Trickster. In this clip, there's a lot of nice Love Planet movement, and yeah, his Love Planet movement basically set the standard, I think. Future players took note of this and added upon it and took influence, you know, but for example, Beautiful Mo, I think in one of the Truestyle tournaments, whether it be in 3 or 4, I think it's the 4th Truestyle tournament, he uses Trickster and sort of has a similar playstyle by using the pull, moving towards enemies, getting to a wall and wall running, this sort of stuff, and it inspired me as well personally in how I play this room. Really ahead of its time, honestly. He also sometimes drops combos on purpose so that he can do a wall run. This is just to add flash. Obviously, you're not using wall run to like move away from danger or get close to another enemy. It's just for flash, and it shows how very early on in DMC3's meta development, players used moves that do not necessarily benefit or aren't practical in any way. They just do it for the flash, which is something that we'll see a lot more in the future. But yes, this is very early on into the development. We also see how he will JC a wall run. It's fairly crazy to think about it being done this early in like 2006 or whatever it came out. We also see in this last clip really good positioning with dive kick. So when an enemy is laying down, dive kick in DMC3 tracks, but it doesn't track perfectly. It's not like a laser. You still have to position your dive kick a certain way so that you can, 1, hit the enemy, and 2, be able to jump cancel off of it. Because if you dive kick from an awkward angle, you won't be able to jump cancel off of an enemy that is laying down, or even one that is standing up, but mostly laying down. And we see him position himself perfectly for dive kick, and to be able to JC it at a variable range. One thing is to learn how to dive kick and jump cancel it at the right time when you're really close to an enemy. The timing is basically consistent for you. But if you do it from a far range, it's more demanding on your timing, your high hand-eye coordination, to jump cancel, to time the jump cancel and follow up with something. And I think that's really nice to see, is that he positions himself with air hike almost intuitively so that he can jump cancel off of an enemy laying on the floor. But yes, this is one of my favorite videos of all time. The music, the gameplay, just flashy, it's beautiful. And this video basically cements why I think he is basically the first competent freestyler for Devil May Cry, and we'll see more of that later on. Next we have a small little, you know, Agni and Rudra fight with Dante, and he's basically doing Royal Guard with him. One of the key things to notice here is how he lets the enemies hit each other. So when you're fighting Agni and Rudra, you can stand in between them, and whether you block or jump out of the way, you cause both of them to like hit each other. And if done right, it can cause the enemy's sword to like fly off, and then you can sort of freely attack them. We also see that he uses jump for easier jump canceling. So if you don't know, jump has invincibility frames, as do other moves, but jump is one of those moves. And if you royal guard during this invincibility frame time, when you're getting hit, you get an automatic guard. It makes things easier to royal guard. But it is one of the earlier cases of this technique being used. Now we get to Rising Dragon Shrigma. So he showcases some brilliant Quicksilver invulnerability stuff. For those of you who don't know, Quicksilver has a pretty nice lenient invulnerability window when you activate it. And so yeah, you just see him just go through attacks and stuff. The syncs here are amazing, especially with that like Rising Dragon Beast Uppercut charge thing. It's just so, it looks so epic with the pause of the Quicksilver and the synchronization together. I love this music choice, by the way. I first heard it from Beautiful Mo's Truestyle Tournament 3 entry, which we will talk about in the future. We get some Ray JCs between 2 enemies with Virgil. When he kills the first one, he's able to move towards the enemy using rays and kill the other one, which is pretty nice. He also switches between enemies when he activates Quicksilver with Dante. It's pretty nice to see. We see some brilliant Trickster movement in the Trial of Warrior room. He is able to map out the room so where he does wall run into a pole play and then into a wall run. It's peak TatsumaruBlack. He's able to JC this time with grounded Volcano JCs. Again, this Volcano JCs are pretty ahead of its time. he understands Jester's guard patterns. Most people see this attack and they think they have to block every time that Jester shoots out a wave of orbs. But in reality, if you stay in the same spot, one of those waves will miss. It's a pattern of you block the first wave, you ignore the second wave if you're standing still, you block the third wave, and then so on and so forth. He uses some good stuff with dive kick. Yeah, he's able to adjust his height with dive kick pretty well. And finally, we have some door usage so that he can get a release on the enemy. Okay, so this is one of my favorite videos of all time as well. It's called Immortals Volume 2. It's a collaboration with TatsumaruBlack and another player called Gemasis, which I might make a video in the future, but to be quite frank, I don't know much about him, and I kind of really like maybe like 3 of his works, but we'll probably talk about him in a shorter episode. But I think this is one of the first videos of this is probably the first video I saw from TatsumaruBlack that got me introduced to him, and it's still one of my favorite videos of all time. It just, you know, the music, everything is so good. So one thing to note here is that mostly shirtless Dante and Virgil is TatsumaruBlack. The player that has a coat on him is Gemasis. Generally speaking, I think there is one case where this doesn't apply. So for this first clip, I'm not sure if this is TatsumaruBlack, but given the classic interlacing that we see in TatsumaruBlack videos, this is probably him. But we see more Virgil into dive kick rave JCs in the air, and then he finishes it off with trick up into Helmbreaker into JC and repeat. This basically combines the first 2 things that we were talking about when it comes to Virgil, which are the setup of like trick up Helmbreaker JCs, but also the rave into dive kick JCs. He combines those 2 together and it looks really sick, really fluid. It really did set the standard for what a typical Virgil combo should look like when it comes to freestyle. Here is quite frankly one of my favorite clips of all time. You know how the door kind of pokes out his large hand and tries to hit you? Well, he uses that to release against an enemy. These aren't perfect release, but who cares, bro? Like, he's jump canceling on an enemy and like doing release while the enemy is still in the air. And he doesn't do that once, he does that twice, except the second time the enemy is laying on the ground. Again, these aren't perfect releases, but the fact that this was done at all is just crazy to me. It really blew my mind at the time, and yes, it's so good. And then the next clip after that is like a release back to back on this Nirvana talk. Is just, it's so beautiful. Again, not perfect releases. He takes some damage because of this, but come on, dude, like this back and forth movement is just so good. We see another clip in the Love Planet, and I think in this clip he's way more fluent than the first clip. He just is more varied. He moves from point A to point B much more. Just beautiful Love Planet. Also, even though this is a TatsumaruBlack video, I love this clip from Gemasis. It's just such a nice fast clip. Now this clip, remember the whole, like, you know, you trick up Helmbreaker and do blistering swords on JC, or rather a sword storm? Well, this is it. This is the same thing, but with blistering swords. Now one may say, wow, blistering swords, like, it's just another sword formation. But no, the reason why this is difficult is because you're doing it with a back input instead of the forward input. So generally speaking, if you're doing sword storm, you're holding the analog stick forwards anyways. And it could be that the input you use for trick up, which is a forward input, overlaps with your sword storm input, and it makes things easier. You just have to move the analog stick forward. But when you're doing blistering swords, you have to move the analog stick back. Again, this might not seem like a lot, you know, it's kind of standard nowadays, but that's the whole point, is that this created the standard. Also, this is the last clip of this video, and my god, this is so fucking sick. So just consider this, right? I don't know how this works. I haven't tried it. I mean, I have tried it, but I didn't do it. I tried it very little at the time, but I'm pretty sure when you clash against the Hell Vanguard, you have to JC it in order to do pole play again. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's it. And so this clip is just insane. Even for today's standards, if somebody did this in freestyle right now, I'd be shitting everywhere. Okay, so this is a Quicksilver video, stylish Quicksilver. First off, I want to note how he uses Quicksilver to sort of emphasize certain moves, especially if they're dying, if the enemy is dying on that hit. It just looks beautiful. It's so nice. This is perhaps the first time we see Helmbreaker JC into other attacks on an enemy. You usually see Helmbreaker JCs when the enemy is laying on the ground. First instance, really, of a Helmbreaker being JC'd into wing or something. He also JCs into the Quicksilver snap enemy. If you're activating Quicksilver during the move animation, you get the Quicksilver, but without any animation from the Quicksilver snap. But if you do it outside of a move, whether you're running, jumping, falling, you can do and get this snap animation. It just looks sick. Now we get to basically his last video in this era, which is Eternal Legend. This is his last major video, and according to him, was time consuming for real life reasons and some disinterest as well. According to him, other videos took hours to record, while this took a few days. Here we see him holding shoot for Artemis while doing some complex jump canceling. Here he wall runs through the door, which shows how wall running is pretty useful in terms of invincibility frames. And invincibility frames are pretty plentiful when it comes to wall running. Here he uses more ground JCs, and what is impressive about this is that he uses large hops, large jump cancel hops, to avoid an enemy hitting him, and he still continues afterwards. So it shows a level of improvisation and sort of fluidity to be able to dodge an attack, but also continue to wail on the enemy. We see more Helmbreaker JCs. So this is quite interesting on an airborne enemy, and he uses shotgun as well, side switching with Helmbreaker. He also free rides on one enemy and then air hikes into another enemy to do a free ride. This is a nice little sort of slick checkpoint to checkpoint type thing. And for this last clip, it's pretty impressive because he's doing rave JCs, but doing blistering swords during those JCs. Now, you can do blistering swords during the rave animation or during the jump cancel animation, but it's preferably done during the rave animation. The reason why I say that is that if you move the analog stick back while you're doing a jump cancel, it causes the next move to drift backwards. And if you don't JC quickly after that next move, you create so much space between you and the enemy horizontally that you cannot JC. So seeing him do blistering swords with this timing is really impressive for 2007, because, and I see this a lot with newer players that are trying to learn Virgil, even to this day, this is kind of hard to do. In my opinion, it's not that hard to do. I don't know why, I just kind of had a natural aptitude to doing this, but it does take some timing, and to see this in 2007 is like mind-boggling, knowing that modern day players kind of had trouble doing this. And so for his last video of this era, this isn't really, I think this isn't really a full-fledged video like the other one, but it is a Truestyle tournament tribute, which for those of you who don't know, TatsumaruBlack was one of the first people that created Truestyle tournament. He's one of the first participants. Him and like 3-4 other players participated. So this is a Truestyle tournament tribute for the next generation in his time. And not much interesting stuff happens here compared to his last videos in terms of progress being made. But there is one thing that I want to note, and this is how he uses DT flying to get towards the target. So for those of you who don't know, if you are in double trigger and you hold down lock on and jump, you actually float a little bit in the air and descend slowly. It's crazy to me because he's doing this so early on into the game's development. You really see this kind of movement neglected for about a decade until like people like Blowhard and me started using DTs to glide from one enemy to another. Now let's see how he evolved some of his techniques over time. First, we're going to be looking at Summon Sword formation. We see how he went from doing the whole trick up into Helmbreaker thing, starting off with Sword Storm, and then he moves up to Blistering Sword, which is a little bit harder. And as I explained earlier, it's harder because you have to use a back input after or around doing a forward input, so you're not constantly holding the analog stick forward. And then he's able to use Blistering Swords during jump cancels, which, as I said, can mess up your JC sequences if you do it wrong. Secondly, we see how he went from short ground JCs with Helmbreaker and Dive Kick to JCs on a grounded enemy that are lengthier and use Volcano, a move that doesn't do any damage. And then he eventually starts using Rebellion and Cerberus, being much more varied than in the first two instances. Another good example is how he evolved in terms of his Love Planet movement. At first it seems a bit more repetitive and he isn't moving around the room as much, and later on in Rising Dragon Sigma we get to see how much more he moves around the stage. We also see how his Quicksilver jump cancels start to improve over time. Starts off doing dive kick and swing jump cancels, but then he starts adding on a Helmbreaker and switching sides and also using shotgun during these JCs. JCs. It's really important, as I mentioned earlier, how he's able to JC a Helmbreaker on an airborne enemy. We don't really get to see that done without Quicksilver until a fair amount later into the game's development. We see how he releases doors using the environment against enemies. He starts off by doing it on a grounded enemy, but eventually in Immortals Volume 2, we get to see him do it on airborne enemies. But yes, that concludes the TatsumaruBlack era. Unfortunately, afterwards, he hasn't uploaded any. Oh, wait. Oh, wait, he has. Okay, so, actually, when DMC Devil May Cry came out, he made a video and didn't really like it. Took another long hiatus until DMC 5 came out, and when I say hiatus, I mean related to DMC, he would still upload stuff. When DMC 5 came out, he basically made thoughts and opinions content, and eventually started playing the game. But then he eventually caught up to the meta development that has happened while he was absent all these years. I'd say that that is pretty rare. In fact, it's probably the only person who has done that with such an extended leave. You see, he got good at Devil May Cry 5, Devil May Cry 4, and then DMC 3 with Style Switch. He would post a video called Motivation, another video series called DMC 4 Dante Lab, which has a volume 1 and 2. One of my favorites that has been uploaded recently is called Numero Uno. There are other good videos that he has uploaded, but I think those are the main ones that I would recommend, just because it shows his progress as a player. You see, it's incredibly rare to see somebody who plays Devil May Cry 3 and get really good at Devil May Cry 4 or Devil May Cry 5. It's incredibly rare. I've seen many players come and go, and most players who like Devil May Cry 3 stay with Devil May Cry 3 because they prefer the gameplay. And so that is already a very rare quality to come from Devil May Cry 3 and basically show off fairly complex and difficult things with Devil May Cry 4. For example, we see some skyrunning in his gameplay. That is a fairly difficult technique. Of course, isolated, it's a lot easier, but actually using it in practice can be a lot more difficult. During this time, he uploads a few videos from the past. We see RG Symphony and In the Era Retrospective. Those are some videos that showcase more footage from that era that wasn't released. And we get to see some RG jump releases on Judgment Cut. This is a technique that they called Orb Warp during, I think it was 2006, 2005? I don't know. Gemasis and Tatsumaru created this technique. And then we see some DMC4 Dante gameplay from 2008, which might explain his abilities in DMC4, because he does have some background in it, even though it's not extensive compared to his DMC3 experience. But yeah, it is a fairly rare quality to be a DMC3 player and move up to a different game and be good at it. And even more rare is for somebody who has been mostly absent for over a decade and then come back pretty strong, and in many cases better than a lot of players who, with modern tools and resources, aren't able to get as good as Tatsumaru is in DMC4, for example. We see people come back after like maybe 5 years and completely destroy everybody, but this is kind of on another level. I wouldn't say that his gameplay is the best in any game at the moment compared to today's standards, but I will say that it's up there, and that's quite impressive given how many games he plays at the moment. And also given how he probably doesn't even have that much time to play these games compared to, when he was younger, of course, because when you grow up, you have more responsibilities. But yeah, this is DMC Hall of Fame, covering TatsumaruBlack, one of my favorite players of all time. I'll put links in the description of his videos and maybe his social media. And I thank you for watching. I tried to make this video a bit more organized. It took a bit longer to make. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.